March 23, 1943, 4 in the morning, an unprecedented shock. The wind on the Tunisian plateau still carried the chill of the desert. Major General Fritz von Broich, commander of the German 10th Panzer Division, sat in his command vehicle, listening to the roar of 50 tank engines grinding across the earth. A cold smirk formed on his lips. 6,000 soldiers, a tank destroyer company, an assault gun company, ample forces, open terrain. Every condition before dawn was as perfect as a carefully rehearsed hunt. He had every reason to believe the next few hours would be a devastating slaughter, because he had done exactly this just 5 weeks ago. In the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February, the Germans tore the American positions to shreds. 183 American tanks were reduced to scrap iron. Over 3,000 American soldiers became prisoners. The nearly annihilated unit paid a price of 6,000 casualties. The entire U.S. 1st Armored Division collapsed like paper before the German armored columns. Frontline commanders could not even organize effective resistance before being scattered. Field Marshal Rommel himself had said Americans were nothing but inexperienced amateurs. Field Marshal Kasserine was confidently counting on this battle to let the Germans take the entire Tunisian highlands. Even senior British generals, General Montgomery and Field Marshal Alexander, had long since privately concluded that American training and command hopeless. British frontline soldiers even jokingly called the Americans our Italian allies. In that context, perhaps the most cutting insult you could hear. And now, at Guettar, von Broich looked across the open ground at the American unit he had crushed just 5 weeks ago. The 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, Terry Allen men. He fully expected the script to play out exactly the same way, but what awaited him was an entirely different outcome. At 10 in the morning, the sun climbed over the Tunisian plateau, and von Broich tanks plunged straight into a minefield that had not existed 5 weeks earlier. The tanks were forced to slow down for mine clearance, and at this most vulnerable moment, the carefully positioned American anti-tank guns opened fire. The M10 tank destroyers of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion emerged from concealed positions that German scouts had completely failed to detect. American firepower rained down on the German armored forces with a precision coordination the Germans had never witnessed. Anti-tank gun positions coordinated fire in real time via radio, each salvo precisely covering the densest concentrations of German armor. In less than an hour, 30 of his 50 tanks were turned into burning wreckage on the open ground. Steel corpses, billowing black smoke, scattered across the Tunisian sand like an apocalyptic scene. By noon, the valley he had expected to take before lunch had instead become the heartbreaking ground from which the 10th Panzer Division fled in disarray. Von Broich was completely stunned. Captured documents clearly showed this was indeed the same division, the same regimental designations, even many of the same officers. The Big Red One he had fought at Kasserine Pass, the Big Red One he now faced at Guettar, wore the same patches, had the same unit history, the same names on the roster, but they were no longer the same army. This kind of uncanny thing would play out again and again, in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in the Ardennes. The phenomenon was so widespread that German officers in post-war interrogations could only describe it with one word over and over: incomprehensible. They had just pounded an American unit into the ground last week, and the next week they faced what seemed like an entirely different army with a different soul. They could not figure out where this terrifying speed of adaptation and devolution came from. They could not find the source, and though they racked their brains trying to imitate it, they simply could not learn it. Because the core of this system was not any single person, any genius, any secret technology, but rather an organizational method, a cultural gene. It had permeated every capillary of the American military. That morning, what von Broich witnessed firsthand was absolutely not dumb luck, nor was it an accident. This was a system the United States Army had quietly built over the past 15 years, bearing its fangs on the battlefield for the first time. a system the Germans did not even know existed, a system that when it ran at full throttle in Normandy could transform an American infantry division into the fastest learning war machine in modern military history. To understand why Von Breuch tanks were reduced to scrap iron at El Guettar, we must first look at what the Germans had that the Americans did not, and then look at what the Americans built that the Germans could never surpass. For most of the 20th century, if you asked anyone who seriously studied warfare which army had the best tactics in the world, you would always get the same answer: the Germans. This was not propaganda, it was industry consensus. Since the Prussian Wars of Unification in the 1860s, the German army had been honing tactical skills that every modern army had to copy. They had a doctrine called mission command, which allowed subordinate commanders to act without consulting superiors. As long as they achieved the ultimate intent, they could fight and adapt however they saw fit. They possessed the most elite officer corps in the world. Every company commander required more than 10 years of rigorous training before they could operate independently. Their sergeants were not ordinary soldiers but true professionals, each capable of independently leading a small unit on the battlefield. Their field manuals were translated into multiple languages and placed on the desks of West Point, Sandhurst, and St. Cyr for study. From 1939 to 1941, the German Wehrmacht rolled over Poland in 5 weeks, took France and the Low Countries in 6, and swept the Balkans in less than a month. Entire enemy formations surrendered en masse before the Germans' breathtaking combined arms warfare. The French Maj in a line that they were so proud of became useless. The British Expeditionary Force fled from Dunkirk back to Britain. The entire European continent trembled before the German tide of steel. By comparison, the United States Army of that era could barely call itself an army. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the total strength of the U.S. Army was less than 200,000, ranking behind Portugal. Their infantry was still reeling with World War I relics. Tactical doctrine was written in field manuals, barely revised in 20 years. Still fixated on trench warfare, their armored warfare doctrine naively assumed tanks would never face enemy tanks head-on. As for their air-ground coordination, in the words of one observer, it was virtually non-existent. When General George Marshall took over as Army Chief of Staff in September 1939, he inherited a force that was mocked. Most European officers privately mocked as Boy Scouts in uniform, but Marshall did not see what they saw. He saw a system locked in outdated thinking. The German advantage was real, but it had a fatal weakness. It depended entirely on people. German military excellence was built on a belief that excellence came from individual genius carefully cultivated over a career. Their officers required over 10 years of rigorous training. Their sergeants were true professionals, their tactical instincts forged through countless exercises and combat. This system was unbeatable in the short term, but it had a problem the Germans never wanted to face. It could not be replicated. An excellent German company commander took 10 years to develop, but he could die in 10 minutes on the battlefield. And when they died, the experience, intuition, and judgment honed over a decade went into the grave with them. New officers had to start from scratch, spending another 10 years accumulating new experience. And in war, nobody gives you 10 years. Even more fatally, German military culture treated experience as personal property rather than collective wealth. Tactical skills that a veteran had figured out in combat often existed only in his own head. If he was killed, those lessons paid for in blood disappeared with him. And if he survived, he would only pass these skills on to the handful of men directly under his command, never thinking to systematically share them with the entire army. It was like a company where every employee worked independently, never holding review meetings, never writing documentation. All knowledge passed by word of mouth. Once key people left, everything had to start from zero. German frontline lieutenants frequently complained that the tactical orders they received were always outdated. Because those orders were written by rear staff based on combat experience from months or even a year ago, while the battlefield situation had already turned upside down. A German company commander who had learned how to deal with Soviet T-30 for tanks on the Eastern Front might never pass his experience to comrades in North Africa. This information silo effect was fatal in war. It meant that every German relief, every personnel transfer, was accompanied by massive loss of experience and decline in combat effectiveness. Marshal saw this weakness and decided to build an entirely different system. His philosophy of army building was simple, almost brutal. If excellence could not depend on genius, then genius must be made unnecessary. He wanted to build a system that could transform every engagement experience, every failure lesson, every ordinary soldier flash of insight into training material for everyone. The core of this system was not heroes, but feedback. In 1940, Marshal held the largest military exercise in American history in Louisiana. 470,000 soldiers fought against each other across vast wilderness. But what made this exercise truly remarkable was not its scale, but the design philosophy behind it. After each engagement, the umpire team would meticulously record the consequences of every tactical decision, the cause of every mistake, the key to every success. Then these records were quickly organized into teaching materials and distributed to every unit. Failure in exercises was not a disgrace, but a textbook. Lessons from exercises were not secrets but shared resources. Marshal even specially assembled a team of experienced officers as observers. Their sole mission was to find problems, record problems, and analyze problems during the exercises. These observers were not umpires there to grade the exercises, but scientists there to collect data. They carried notebooks and cameras, documenting every tactical movement, every communication failure, every logistics bottleneck. After the exercises, these observation reports were quickly compiled into training manuals and distributed to every regimental level unit in the Army within weeks. This approach was simply inconceivable to the Germans. In the German military, failure was a disgrace, something to be covered up. A German officer who made a mistake in an exercise faced not systematic improvement suggestions, but the contempt of peers and the cold stare of superiors. So German officers only ever learned from their own experience, while American soldiers learned from everyone's experience. In 1942, when the first American units arrived on the North African battlefield, this system was still in its infancy. The crushing defeat at Kasserine Pass was on the surface a disaster. But from a systems perspective, it was an extraordinarily valuable data collection exercise. The position, angle, and trajectory of every tank destroyed by the Germans were meticulously recorded. Every failed tactical decision was reviewed and analyzed. Every successful small-scale resistance was extracted and studied for why it succeeded. This data was rapidly sent back to analysis centers in the rear, where a team of retired officers, military scholars, and statisticians began dissecting the defeat. They were not looking for scapegoats, but for patterns. They discovered that German armored assaults always concentrated on the weakest junction points in the American defensive lines. They discovered that the American communication system was nearly paralyzed by German electronic interference, making coordination between units impossible. They discovered that there were serious tactical deficiencies in the attack angles and distances of American anti-tank weapons against German armor. These findings were not locked in a safe, but were incorporated into new training manuals within weeks and sent to every American unit in training. Within 5 weeks, from Kasserine Pass to Guettar, the American military completed a tactical evolution that the Germans considered absolutely impossible. The soldiers who had been crushed by German armor at Kasserine Pass now knew how to delay tanks in minefields, how to strike armored targets from the flank with anti-tank guns. The units that had fought independently at Kasserine Pass because of communication breakdown now had backup communication channels and emergency contact protocols. The gunners who had died in vain at Kasserine Pass because they did not know German armor weaknesses now knew the armor distribution of German tanks inside out. And all this took only 5 weeks. 5 weeks, in the German system, was not even enough for a new officer to complete basic training. But in the American system, 5 weeks was enough to completely transform a defeated army, because in the American system, learning was not an individual matter but a systemic one. Guettar was not a fluke victory. It was the first combat validation of the American military learning system. And this system would only grow stronger and faster throughout the war. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The 10 days after D-Day were the most stunning demonstration of this system operating speed. Soldiers of the U.S. 29th Infantry Division were struggling through the Normandy hedgerows. These hedgerows were unique to Normandy, dense embankments covered with bushes and small trees, turning every field into a natural fortress. The Germans turned every hedgerow into a defensive position, machine gun nests at the base, anti-tank guns hidden at the corners. Every time American troops tried to cross open ground, they were torn apart by sudden fire from behind the hedgerows. The first days in Normandy were like throwing flesh against a wall. Casualties climbed at a suffocating pace, but this time no one had to wait 5 weeks to see change. Because now, this feedback system had been running for 2 years. It had absorbed enough experience from North Africa and Sicily to know how to transform battlefield lessons into tactical changes at maximum speed. In Normandy, the Americans solved the hedgerow tactical problem in just 10 days, and the solution came from the most unlikely place, an ordinary sergeant named Curtis Culin. Culin was a tank crewman in the 29th Infantry Division. He noticed that the Germans frequently used the hedgerow embankments to block American tank advances. Every time a tank tried to cross a hedgerow, it exposed its vulnerable underside to German anti-tank weapons. Culin came up with a simple but brilliant solution. He suggested welding steel tetrahedra salvaged from German beach obstacles to the front of tanks, creating rhino horn-like steel teeth that could slice through hedgerow embankments. This modification, later called the Rhino Tank by historians, allowed American tanks to slice through hedgerows like a knife through butter. What was truly stunning about Culin's story was not how clever his invention was, but that it took less than 10 days for one-man idea to become equipment for the entire army. Culin reported his idea to his company commander, who reported it to the battalion commander, who reported it to the division commander. In a traditional army, this process could take months. But in Marshal's system, every level knew that innovations from the front line had to be reported and promoted at maximum speed. The division commander approved the trial that same day, and the next day ordered all tanks in the division to be modified. Simultaneously, this innovation spread to other divisions through the Corps Intelligence Bulletin system. What they thought were impregnable natural fortresses now became passages for American tanks. From Kasserine Pass to Guettar took 5 weeks. From the Normandy landings to the hedgerow breakthrough took only 10 days. The system was accelerating, adaptation was accelerating, while the Germans were still using their old method of spending 10 years to forge a single sword. Culin was no military genius. He was just an ordinary sergeant from New York, an ordinary man who had been a mechanic before being drafted. But in Marshal's system, he did not need to be a genius. He only needed to have a good idea, and the system would turn his idea into a weapon for everyone. This was what the Germans could never understand in their system. Only genius could change the course of battle. In the American system, any ordinary soldier could become the one who changed everything. Because the system did not care where an idea came from, it only cared whether the idea worked. By the end of 1944, the Americans had built an intelligence-sharing network covering the entire European theater. Tactical experience gained by every division, every regiment, even every battalion in combat would be compiled into reports within 24 hours and sent to the Army Group Analysis Center. There, dedicated teams would transform this raw data into actionable tactical recommendations, then distribute them to all units through daily battle reports and training bulletins. This meant that if an American infantry company in the Ardennes discovered a new way to deal with German snipers, Another infantry company, as far away as Alsace, could learn the same method in less than 48 hours. On the German side, the same information might never leave the company that discovered it. Because the Germans had no such system, their experience transmission still relied on personal relationships and accidental encounters. The final verdict was this: Germany lost World War II against the Western Allies, not because their soldiers were inferior, nor because their equipment was inferior. In terms of individual soldier quality and equipment performance, German infantry and armored troops remained extremely formidable until the last weeks of the war. What the Germans truly lost was a race of adaptability. Their philosophy of army building was that excellence came from individual genius carefully cultivated over a career, while the American philosophy was that excellence came from a system that could transform every engagement and every failure into training material for everyone. The former produced a group of awe-inspiring warriors. The latter forged a war machine that never stopped evolving. In 3 years, the system defeated genius. In just 10 days in Normandy, the system crushed genius again at an even faster pace. If this forensic dissection of history has moved you, please smash that like button and subscribe to our channel. War is a system, and the people who fight are not cold numbers. They have names. Curtis Culin had a name. Roberts from Tennessee had a name. Von Broich watched his tanks turn to wreckage at Guettar, because somewhere behind the American lines, a sergeant lessons from a week earlier had already reached the mind of a gunner. That was the sentence the German army never learned to write, and by the time they finally understood, the war was already over.